Freakonomics Radio is sponsored by Adidas. Check out the latest footwear innovation from Adidas, the Adizero Adios Pro 2, which features carbon fiber energy rods that are both lightweight and precisely tuned for a more anatomical transition. Everything from the ultra-light polyester upper to the re-sculpted midsole and the reinvented outsoles are designed for speed. Visit adidas.com to learn more today.
Some read self-help books. Others use meditation. At New Balance, it's believed that peace can be found with a run. You're never truly prepared for adversity, but certain things serve as a guide for moving forward. Whether sprinting or running marathons, the physical and mental requirements become ingrained. Visualizing an outcome, synchronizing breath and body, pushing past pain and fatigue. Those hard-learned lessons serve as a blueprint for overcoming obstacles and achieving balance in life. Go beyond the run at newbalance.com.
I was just a bit frustrated. I had this huge pile of stories that I wanted to tell and no outlet for. And of course, I thought, well, I can just start a podcast, which is just the brilliance of the medium, that it doesn't require a huge amount of commitment or investment at the start. You can just give it a go.
Hey folks, welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Mason. I'm actually not your host today because today's a Throwback Thursday episode. Kurt Linville's hosting this show. He was the previous host. And this episode actually goes back a handful of years. We're talking to Christopher Sleight, and it's all about mountaineering in the winter in Scotland. And I think it's a good time because, winter's going to be here before you know it. And Christopher's such a good storyteller. You're really going to enjoy this. But like I said, winter's going to be upon us soon, and it's good to come up with a plan now of how you're going to stay active when the days are shorter, when it's not as comfortable outside because it's freezing, or if you like skiing, then you're going to be happy. Versus me, who just every winter is a challenge because I don't deal with the cold really well. So it's like, okay, stay active, do the things you love. You can get through this. I don't have to worry about it as much now because we're a little farther south, but it is an important time of year mentally, physically, to stay active and stay healthy. So this will be good. This will be a good conversation. And also, before we get going, I did want to mention for all our patrons, we have a big announcement coming next week. And for everyone else, big announcement coming with our Patreon team or Patreon club. So if you're a part of that, thank you. If you're not, I would consider jumping on because it's going to be cool. All right, let's get into today's episode.
Hello and welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast. This is your host, Kurt Linville. Today we have Christopher Sleight with us. And Christopher Sleight is a mountaineering enthusiast from Scotland currently. He is also the host of the Mountain Podcast. And so we're going to talk about that later in the show. But Chris grew up in the UK and has moved to Scotland, where he now lives in a national park within sight of some of Scotland's high peaks. And I'm really excited to visit with him about that. He's a new mountain biker, just took up the sport, and he also enjoys rock climbing and mountaineering, and especially winter mountaineering. Christopher, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be on.
Christopher, fill in the bullet points there. I gave just a little bit of information, but tell us, who is Chris, what's your story, and how did you get started in adventure sports?
Well, I got started through the Boy Scouts in England, which, I guess is a really common route for a lot of people. My dad as well was quite keen on walking, and we used to go on holidays quite a bit up to the Yorkshire Dales in England and also down to Cornwall where my grandparents lived, which has some beautiful coastal walks. So I'd been introduced to it that way, and then I actually lived in a place called Hertfordshire, which is just north of London, which is very, very flat. There aren't any mountains at all. I think the highest bit of Hertfordshire is about sort of 200 or 300 feet altitude, pretty low. But luckily, Hertfordshire Scouts had a base up in Scotland in the, what is now the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park. It wasn't a national park back then, actually. And when I was about 14, we had the sort of opportunity to go up and spend a week in the mountains. And I can remember, and I always try and think of this whenever I'm offered an opportunity and I'm wondering whether to take it, because I was thinking, shall I go on this course? None of my friends are going. It was a sort of introduction to mountaineering course, and didn't have any other friends going. My dad said, just go, you'll have a great time. And so I thought, okay, I'll go, I'll see. And that was the sort of beginning of a lifelong love affair with the mountains for me. And in fact, some of the friends I met on that first week are still the people that I climb with, walk with, canoe with now. And I just think, wow, what if I hadn't made that decision? How different would my life have been? And that's what triggered it all off for me, really.
Wow. So isn't that something when it just kind of the last minute, well, I don't know, and then you do something and it changes your life. I actually almost didn't go out the night that I met my wife. And she was not going to go out either. She had already gone to bed. And it's just kind of funny because for whatever reason, we both decided that we would go out, and we met each other, and now we've had a lifetime together. So it's amazing how the small decisions can make such a huge impact.
I think so. And it's a philosophy that I try and live with now, because it's very easy to turn away those opportunities, either because, you're a bit tired, or you think you're maybe a bit short of cash, or you just say, oh no, I don't know. Somebody offers you a chance to go on a trip somewhere or do something, or maybe even try a new job for a while or anything. And I just think that so much can be changed by taking up these opportunities. And I do. I think my life would have been very different if I hadn't have taken that opportunity. I arrived in Scotland. It was really good weather, actually, which is quite unusual for Scotland. And we may talk a bit about that later on. But I think it was sort of early mid-April, can be still full-on sort of winter conditions in the mountains of Scotland at that time of year. But it was really, really hot and sunny, although there was quite a bit of snow around. And I just thought, wow, this is amazing. Of course, I came back, went back the following year, and the weather wasn't nearly as nice. But there was something about mountains and snow, and also the sort of kit you need with it. I love sort of packing an ice axe, packing my crampons, and that sort of stuff, and heading up into the high mountains and into the snow.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I try to get at least one high peak a winter, and if possible more, because I also love it. It's such a different experience than in the summertime. But tell us more about Scotland. We have a lot of listeners from all over the world, and of course many in the United States who may have never been there. So what are the Scottish Highlands like?
Scotland is really an incredible place. It's, I guess on a world scale, it's quite a small country, but it's a lot bigger than you realise. And I think for a lot of people, even who live elsewhere in the UK, when they first come to Scotland and realise that, you'll cross the border with England, and you've got a couple of hours drive before you get up to Glasgow. And then you could carry on driving for about 5 or 6 hours before you finally got up to the north coast, the far north coast of Scotland. But it has, dozens of quite distinct areas. You've got the sort of rolling uplands of southern Scotland, which maybe not quite so spectacular, and not so much sort of climbing, not so much sort of cragging and rock and steep faces, but still beautiful to look at and walk amongst nonetheless. And then you've got the Southern Highlands, which are mountains of around about sort of between 2,500-3,000 feet, a little bit over 3,000 feet. Strongly influenced, like a lot of Scotland's mountains, by the weather that comes in from the Atlantic, which is what gives us these superb winter conditions. A lot of moisture combined with the cold. And then, moving up further north, you've got the mountains up the west coast, and then into the far northwest, which you get these fantastic isolated remote peaks, really, really big days out, where you're not only maybe climbing several pitches, but you've also perhaps got 3 hours to get into the mountain and 3 hours to get back out, or even longer. And then across over in the east, we have the Cairngorms, which again are sort of different mountains, much more sort of bulkier with plateaus and things, but very steep faces and lots of fantastic climbing there. And then you've got the islands as well. So all the way down the west coast of Scotland, you have just this beautiful run of islands, the Inner and Outer Hebrides. Not so many of the higher peaks on those, apart from Skye, where you have probably the best mountaineering expedition that you could have in the UK, if not a lot of Europe, I would argue, which would be a traverse of the Coolin Ridge, which most people do in 2 days, but can be done in one long day. And then a lot of smaller mountains and spectacular scenery in the other islands as well. So there's just so much variety to the place, so much to do, and it really is a haven for anybody who likes adventure sports, because whatever flavour you like to take them in, be that sort of climbing, mountaineering, long distance backpacking, mountain biking, road cycling, canoeing, Scotland can offer it.
Man, it sounds delightful. So, Christopher, I have recently kind of caught on to the idea of prominence for peaks. Rather than how tall they are, how prominent are they? And the definition of that is how high the peak is above its nearest saddle, to the next peak. But when you look at a list of peaks by prominence, then it's kind of really telling, because a lot of the high peaks aren't very prominent. So even though they have high elevation, maybe their base is actually not very low. So the peak itself is kind of small above its surrounding terrain. And in Scotland, when you say 3,000 feet, some people might think, well, that's not very high. I mean, Denver, not even in the mountains yet, is at 5,000 feet, but that's zero prominence, right? But you have nearly a full 3,000 feet of prominence with those peaks, don't you?
It depends, like, whereabouts you are. I mean, in the Cairngorms, often you can start pretty high up, but yes, I mean, that is completely what makes certainly winter climbing in Scotland a lot more serious than you might think, and a lot bigger days, because quite often you are starting from sea level, and certainly if you look at Ben Nevis, so the north face of Ben Nevis is one of Scotland's sort of premier winter climbing destinations, and you start pretty close to sea level, so they're all big days, and I think even when you're on some of the islands and you're looking at peaks that are only maybe just over 2,000 feet, they're rising straight up from the sea. So not only are they, sort of bigger days, but they look quite spectacular. It's always amazing to see a mountain sort of rising straight up from the sea. And even if it's only 2,500 feet tall, they do have this presence about them.
Yeah, absolutely. In Colorado, one of the favorite sports here is climbing 14ers. So they're 14,000-foot peaks, which is quite high. But many of the peaks, you start the climb somewhere around 11,000 feet. So 3,000 vertical feet is what the climb really is. You're doing something similar to that in Scotland then. Yeah,
definitely. For a lot of these peaks, you've got... it's a big walk-in, and you're doing a lot of steep walking. And if you're winter climbing, you've got a pack with ropes and a rack and axes and crampons, extra clothing. You've got to lug that quite a way. And some of the some of the corries in Glencoe, for example, have a real reputation for beasting your legs quite early in the day, and especially when it's early in the season and you're still getting your winter fitness, and you're maybe starting in the dark because it's November and December, and you've got shorter days, and sort of toiling your way up these steep slopes to actually get into the corries. It's really a big part of the day. That there isn't an awful lot of sort of roadside winter climbing, ice climbing available in Scotland. Some years if it's really, really cold, but most of it you've got to put the miles in first.
Well, that sounds really delightful. And, I have not been to Scotland yet, and I say yet because I'm definitely planning on coming and enjoying some of those sports you were talking about and seeing the lay of the land. But in the photographs that I've seen, I don't see a lot of trees. I see beautiful windswept mountains. Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, there's... I mean, I live in the middle of a massive forest, so there are areas that do have. I live in the sort of Queen Elizabeth Forest Park, which is a forest park within the national park. So what you see quite commonly is a lot of plantation forestry. So this is like acres and acres of Sitka spruce. There aren't huge areas of indigenous woodland, which is a shame, because the areas that you do find are, as I'm sure you can appreciate in the States, are just the most beautiful experience walking through sort of ancient forests. So, but that's changing. I mean, there's the mission of most conservation bodies in Scotland at the moment is, part of their mission is to plant a lot more native woodland. So there's a huge amount of that going on. We're at a strange cycle at the moment with the rest of the forestry, because it was put in sort of post-war, so it went in the 50s, 60s. So it's just reaching the time, in the last 10 years is when they've started harvesting it. And it's quite an odd experience, because you could have visited an area for decades and got used to the forest, and then suddenly within a couple of months it's clear felled. So, and we have a lot of clear felling that's going on at the moment, a lot of areas that I've got extremely used to over the years, and it's quite disorientating, but also really interesting, because suddenly you're in these spaces where you've never had a view, and you're looking at these vistas thinking, wow, this is actually a really, really nice view from here, but I never realized. So yeah, I mean, there's the significant areas of Scotland are sort of woodland and forestry, but I mean, nowhere near what it would have been historically.
That's interesting. So in the western United States, especially the northwestern United States, there are the old natural forests, and there's all the debate about logging in those forests, and can we do that more responsibly, or how much of the area can we protect and never have it logged? And there's just a lot of debate about that, as there should be. But there are some places, especially in the southeast part of the United States, where people have planted forest as agriculture, and then they clear cut them, just like you're talking about, and people are aghast. You cut the trees, and then they say, we planted the trees. This is a farm. It's a little different approach.
I mean, that's absolutely the case. And in Scotland, I think the forestry industry is worth about £1 billion a year. It's big business for a small country, and it's very important. It's quite. I mean, here it's managed by a body called the Forestry Commission, and it's interesting over the last decade or so is that their function has shifted a bit. So they're still there to manage the forestry and fell it and harvest it and then replant it. But a lot of these forested areas have also become hugely important to recreation. And this is, certainly for things like mountain biking. There's loads. They're putting loads and loads of trails in through the forests and encouraging people to visit. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, a lot of this forestry would have been impenetrable, really, really difficult to get into. But now, those tracks that you see running through a lot of the forests have been opened up to people. And that's part of a wider change in sort of access rights that we've seen, over the last sort of 15, 20 years in Scotland, which you talked about with Bob the other week on the episode with Bob Cartwright from the Outdoor Station. We had this access legislation that came in sort of 2003, I think it was, in Scotland. And part of that has been an opening up of the forests a bit more.
Well, it sounds delightful. I definitely need to get there. My family would enjoy that very, very much. And what I'm finding out, though, from talking to you is that I can't plan a 2-week trip. I need a 2-month trip.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you should come prepared for sort of multi-sports and to do quite a lot. Definitely, but you'd be very welcome. You'd be very welcome to come over. I'd take you up a few hills if you did.
Oh, that would be really, really fun. Speaking of going up some mountains, what is it like winter mountaineering in Scotland in detail? Tell us about a trip that was especially challenging and rewarding.
I think a couple of trips in recent years that I can think of. As we've said, the mountains on a global scale in Scotland are not massively high. They top out at just over 4,000 feet, the highest one, Ben Nevis. But they sort of make up with that with the sort of fierceness of the weather patterns. And also, as we've talked about, you're often starting from sea level. So I think there's a couple of days that comes to mind. One of them in the Cairngorms a couple of years ago with 3 friends, where we climbed on a crag which is called the Shelter Stone. So that actually, you do have a fairly high start with that. You start off at the ski centre car park, so you can get up pretty high. But to get to this cliff, you've got to sort of cross the Cairngorm Plateau and drop into another valley, or a glen as they're called in Scotland. So already that adds quite a bit of adventure to the day, because if you're out in bad weather, as we were on that day, you've got to do some quite serious navigation. It's so easy to get disorientated and lost in the hills of Scotland because you're often out in fairly poor weather. So this day, I'm trying to remember the name of the route we were climbing. I think it was called Western Union Grooves. So in Scottish grades, that would be a 4-5, which is a sort of low mid-grade climb. I have to confess, I know nothing about how you grade winter climbs in the States. Maybe you can enlighten me on that in a minute. So we started this day off with this great sort of adventure, navigating through sort of snow and poor visibility across the Cairngorm Plateau. And then you sort of drop into what feels like another world, because you've left the ski centre, which is really, really busy, obviously, and you've got the cable cars going up and down, loads and loads of skiers, loads of climbers walking into the more accessible corries. But you sort of drop into the Loch Avon Basin, and it's just white and frozen and peaceful, and not so many people go over there. And in fact, that day we had this entire cliff to ourselves. So there's 4 of us on 2 separate routes, and as soon as we were off, we're out of sight of each other, didn't see the other pair all day. And then we had this really absorbing climbing, and a lot of the climbing in Scotland is mixed. So we do have some good ice climbing, but we don't have those super long periods of very, very cold weather often during the winter. So you're often doing a mixture of climbing on ice, but also rock and frozen turf, very important in Scotland. So we then had sort of 4 or 5, maybe 6 pitches of really sort of absorbing mixed climbing, and then you top out and into the sort of gloom of dusk, and then you've got the challenge of navigating back across the plateau as it's getting dark, and finding your way back to the car park. And actually, I really enjoy the climbing, but a big part of a Scottish day is the travel to and from the crag, and using your skills as a navigator and a map and a compass, and walking on bearings in zero visibility perhaps. And there's a tremendous satisfaction. And I can remember this day with my climbing partner Rob, and my other 2 friends were completely out of sight by this time, just trudging across this plateau in the dark, in the wind, in the cloud, and then just popping out at the right spot, and which is so satisfying. And then sort of back to the car park well after dark. But for those sort of days where you start in the dark and you finish in the dark, and you've got 5 or 6 pitches of really absorbing mixed climbing in the middle, they're the days for me that I really, really love. And they're the days that every time I do them, I think, this is why I like winter climbing.
Wow, that sounds like a real adventure. I have to confess, I have a very poor sense of direction, and so when I'm hiking through,
so do I.
Well, when I'm hiking through the mountains, I have to use the lay of the land a lot. I take a compass with me, which I try to avoid using just to build my skill. I can orient myself by the stars and the sun and the moon and that sort of thing. But when the visibility goes away, wow, that can be kind of crazy. So what you're saying is in Scotland, it's frequent that you may not have good visibility.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is with Scottish winter climbing is that you very often climb in poor weather because you can't wait for good weather because we get so little of it. You may get 1 or 2 periods, or sometimes no periods in a winter season where you have a prolonged period of, say, high pressure. You're dealing with these big low pressures rolling in off the Atlantic quite often. It's often really poor visibility. But, you talk about sense of direction, which made me laugh because I have a terrible sense of direction, but I've always viewed that as a real advantage when it comes to navigation, because I never trust my instinct, and I'm always forced to look at a map and compass, which is generally a better thing. And I know people who do have a good sense of direction often who will rely on that a bit too much, and then they get lost. But I mean, obviously these days we will take a GPS on the phone, and we got these fantastic maps, Ordnance Survey maps in the UK, which are absolutely superb and really enhance the outdoor experience here. And in recent years, you've been able to get those available as an app on a smartphone, and you can push the screen and it'll pinpoint exactly where you are on a map. And that is, I do use those, and they are tremendously convenient. And they do, save a lot of time, especially at the top of a climb when you're topping out maybe in a cliff and you're not exactly sure where you are on the map. But there is a real satisfaction to using the map and compass tools, and I guess that's part of being introduced to the outdoors as a scout. That was part of the things that you were taught. You must be able to navigate. You must be able to use a map and compass. But it's certainly for winter climbing in Scotland, it's an essential skill, and it's a skill that is just as important as good climbing technique, because it's no good you being a super hot ice climber and getting to the top of the crag and finishing a route if you can't get back. You're going to get lost on the way back. You're not going to have a successful day, and in fact, a lot of accidents that happen in the UK and that end up with the mountain rescue teams being sent out are because of that. They're not necessarily because of big accidents on climbs, although they do happen, of course. It's because people haven't been able to navigate and they can't get back at the end of the day.
Sure. Well, orienteering, as we call it in the States, is a sport of all in its own right. And a lot of people really enjoy it. And the first time I heard of it, I'll just be candid here, Christopher. The first time I heard of orienteering, I kind of chuckled. I thought, that sounds kind of geeky, because people are counting their steps and staring at a compass and trying to find points on the map. But you know what? I was completely wrong about that. The reality is that knowing those skills is very beneficial, but it's also fun. When my kids were young, I would go into the forest behind our house, and I would tack dollar bills to the trees and then mark the locations on the map. And then I would come back and hand the map to the kids and hand them a compass, and I'd say, go get the money, right? And we had so much fun doing that, and the kids loved it because it was a little treasure hunt,
It is a good skill. I mean, orienteering. So orienteering in the UK is, I guess it means the same thing. It's actually, it's a sport of navigating, and I've never done that. I don't know. Maybe I should give it a go. It might be good fun. But I think you don't have to treat it as a sport in its own right. There's a huge amount of just satisfaction in knowing that you can use these very basic skills, a piece of paper and a magnet, to get yourself across huge areas of space that you would be completely lost in otherwise. And I think it's one of those skills that is maybe sort of waning a bit, because GPS tools are so good, and it's so tempting to use them. And like I said, I use them myself. I really enjoy using them. But it's quite nice to know that as a backup, if my phone loses battery or it can't get a satellite fix or whatever, that I do have this skill. I can pull out the map, I can pull out a compass, and I know that I'm pretty sure I can be able to find my way out of most situations with those two bits of pretty primitive technology.
Well, it really is valuable, too. I have to share another funny story, Chris. This summer, we did a through hike of the Holy Cross Wilderness, and for about 6 days, there were no trails where we were. Simply, they don't have trails to go where we wanted to go. And so we were orienteering without any trail or anything like that to find or navigating might be a more correct word, to find out where we were. Well, on the 6th day, we intersected a trail, and we were going to follow this trail to another trail that would lead us to a lake. And we turned on the trail that goes to the lake and found ourselves completely off somewhere besides where we wanted to be. And we were exhausted because it was the end of a long day of backpacking, and we were in the wrong place because we trusted the trail. And we kind of chuckled because we had no issues when we didn't have a trail going exactly where we wanted to go. But as soon as you let your guard down and you quit watching your navigation, that's when these things happen. So I encourage people, learn how to do it, right? That way you're not dependent on trails or batteries in a GPS unit or a phone.
I mean, we've all got those stories, though, of of getting lost. I mean, I've had my fair share of that, and usually it's happened because the third most important tool in navigating is using your brain and concentrating, and that's the thing that's so easy, especially if you're walking with friends and chatting away, and it's hard mental work, a lot of it, and I've done that where it's happened to me a couple of times where I've picked up a path that is maybe more or less on my bearing, and I've thought, well, it's going to be easier to follow this path, and it's just about on the bearing. But obviously then the path has slowly sort of like drifted off in the wrong direction. And,
right.
and I've been in the situation a couple of times when I've maybe popped out the cloud and thought, I'm actually on the wrong side of the mountain here. I'm going to have to haul my way all the way up and over again. It's easily done.
Oh, that's fun. So let's talk about temperatures just a little bit. When you're doing this type of winter mountaineering in Scotland, how cold is it?
Well, it's quite a lot of the time. You're looking at temperatures that are maybe... now, you're going to ask me to... I'm going to have to convert to Fahrenheit, am I?
I can convert.
In our money,
I'll convert. Give us Celsius. I'll punch it into my converter here.
In our money, you really don't want it to be warmer than about freezing point, and it's best if it's around sort of -3, -4. So I guess there's 32 degrees Fahrenheit and under around there. So you don't want it to be warm and melting. You need it to be below freezing point. Having said that, it's quite common to start the day when it is a bit warmer, and often you'll find that high cliffs can be, because they've got maybe a bit of breeze on them that are keeping them cold enough that there are sort of, it's good enough conditions to winter climb. The thing that we have to watch out for here, well, as anywhere, is the wind chill. I mean, quite often you find yourself climbing in quite strong winds, and that can significantly lower the temperature. Sometimes, we have winters where you might get sort of prolonged periods down to sort of -10 degrees Celsius. It's probably rare to go out in those sort of, you just don't get those temperatures that much in the UK. Generally you're around, between sort of -5 up to 0.
Let's take a quick message break and hear from the folks that help make this show possible.
For the ones finding new ways to ensure the job always gets done. For the ones wearing many hats. For the ones who are hands-on, even from far away. And the ones keeping business moving forward. We are Grainger, offering supplies and solutions for every industry, with 24/7 support and experienced staff at over 250 local branches. Call, clickgrainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Freakonomics Radio is sponsored by Adidas. Check out the latest footwear innovation from Adidas, the Adizero Adios Pro 2, which features carbon fiber energy rods that are both lightweight and precisely tuned for a more anatomical transition. Everything from the ultra-light polyester upper to the resculpted midsole and the reinvented outsoles are designed for speed. Visit adidas.com to learn more today.
That is plenty of that for now. Let's get back into the episode.
Well, you're certainly far enough north to experience very cold temperatures, but it's the moderating influence of the Atlantic, I believe. So with that moderating influence comes tons of moisture. So is it quite humid? I mean, you were talking about popping out of the clouds. It sounds like you're hiking around in nearly 100% humidity.
Yeah, I mean, it's the humidity that gives us the fantastic winter climbing, though. And the classic thing, that we have in Scotland over a winter season is this freeze and then thaw. And that builds up like really good conditions, a really good snow ice, good ice. And especially if you're on a cliff like Ben Nevis, where there's a lot of very, world sort of classic standard ice routes. They grow, but with this sort of freeze thaw cycle that you get. But it's that moisture coming in off the Atlantic and then sort of being dumped onto the faces that gives us these incredibly sort of wintry, these incredible sort of winter conditions with the snow and ice. So, yeah, I mean, it's ideally you're not climbing in the rain. Sometimes it may be a bit rainy. Quite often you may start the day walking in the rain. But I think if you were to pick out a feature of winter climbing in Scotland, then coping with moisture and coping with being wet is generally something that you've got to get used to and you've got to manage.
Well, it sounds so refreshing, and I get kind of excited just thinking about climbing in a new environment because almost all of my climbing has been in the Colorado Rockies, right? And so this is what I know, but what you're talking about sounds delightful. Really, really fun. Speaking of, you have climbed other places. You've done some travel. And let's see, you said that you have made trips over to the Alps. You've been to the Himalayas and also the Canadian Rockies. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the Alps were the first place I visited, the Alps and some of the mountains of Norway. In fact, the trip I did to Norway was the first sort of trip away from home, just with friends. So I think I was 18 or 19. And I shudder to think what we got up to then. I think we were lucky in a way to get through it. I mean, we had a certain amount of knowledge, but obviously when you're in the UK, you don't deal with glaciers at all. And then as soon as you're on the continental Europe, you do. Which adds a whole new sort of objective danger to watch out for. But Norway was really good. I've done a lot of climbing in the French Alps and the Swiss Alps and a bit over on the Italian side as well. And that's a very different flavour to Scotland. You pretty much only ever climb in really, really good weather. And, you've generally got, I mean, that's the other thing you don't have in Scotland. You never really have to have a camp or a bivvy. You don't have to you can go and have an adventure in a day and be back for a hot shower and dinner, which is the other nice aspect of Scottish winter climbing. But I used to love going out to the Alps, and I haven't really been out there since we started a family and we have kids, and I just don't do those sort of holidays anymore, which is fine. We do other stuff, but I really enjoyed climbing in the Chamonix Valley and also climbing in Switzerland, doing mountains that just are a bit bigger and have a different approach to them. And then I went over to Nepal at the end of the 90s, and we went to do a peak there called Singuchuli, or Fluted Peak, which is 6,500 meters.
Wow.
And that is It classified as a trekking peak, but it's got a tricky approach to it and is actually a difficult mountain to climb, and difficult enough that we didn't actually get to the top of it. And I wasn't like super keen on Himalayan climbing. I haven't been back. I think part of it was because, again, we were learning. I was out there with a group of friends, and none of us had climbed in the Himalayan mountains before. And I think we weren't really prepared for the huge sort of loads and the logistics involved in climbing these really big hills. But having said that, the journey up to, there's a sort of trek from the road up to the base camp was just the most wonderful experience. I really, really loved it. And the whole trip has got a very sort of special place in my memories of trips that I've done. Partly because we'd spent 2 or 3 months out there and spent quite a bit of time traveling around the Kathmandu Valley as well, and just a wonderful country to visit. And the last big trip I did, which was the year before my first daughter was born, that was to to BC, to the Waddington Range. So we went in to climb Mount Waddington on the Bravo Glacier route, and didn't get to the top of that one either, but had an awful lot of fun. That, what I found with that range was it was a really nice balance between that accessibility of the Alps, which is quite nice, using cable cars and sort of, being able to get up really high very quickly, but then that sort of erodes that adventurous feel a little bit. And with Canada, it felt like a lot more of an out there adventure, but it wasn't quite as on a massive scale as the Himalayan mountains, and it didn't have a lot of complex logistics. We used a service called White Saddle Air, and there's 2 brothers who have a ranch, and one of them, I believe, has a seaplane. One of them flies the helicopter. And after a really long drive up from Vancouver, you arrive there. We stayed the night, and then there were 6 of us, and I can't remember the guy's name now, but he flew us in 2 trips into the glacier where we set up our base camp. And then we're pretty much on our own. There's no one on the side of the mountain that we were. So it had this really sort of out there feel, quite adventurous feel. You've got to be really self-reliant. But at the end of the trip, you get picked up by a helicopter and don't have huge amounts of I think it's normally sort of 3 days walk bushwhacking from the coast if you want to walk in. So we were quite glad not to have that. And it did feel like a nice combination of, somewhere not too big, but a little bit more remote than the Alps. And I love that trip to Canada. And as soon as I can, I think I would love to go back to that range and spend a bit more time climbing there. It was a lot of fun. We had a base camp, then we had sort of above that, sort of climbed for a day above that, and then built this huge ice cave for all 6 of us, which we used as a base for 2 or 3 nights, and including the day that we made an attempt on the summit. So it was a really, really fun expedition, and I loved Canada as well. A wonderful place.
Oh, I agree. Canada is delightful, and it has some very remote areas, but like you said, logistically, it's a little bit more doable. Perhaps it's a perfect balance.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice. So I have to ask you about mountain biking, and the reason is because you said you just started, and I'd love to get your perspective on the sport from someone who's just dipping his toe in the water, so to speak.
Well, I have a sort of, when I was, I had a bike up until I was in my sort of early 20s, but it was a road bike, and I really enjoyed that. And then I just moved somewhere where I moved to London, and I didn't have room to keep a bike. So I sort of got out of cycling. And then when I guess I never got back into it, because it's always a big investment, I think, when you start a new sport. You know, you've got a lot of equipment to buy, and I was really getting into climbing and hill walking and focusing on that and doing these trips that we've been talking about. And it's only in the last couple of years. So all my kids have bikes. My wife has a bike, and they go off cycling, and I started to feel a bit left out about that. I wanted to join them on the trips. But then I started to read about this, what we call in the UK, bike packing. I don't know if is it similar? You call it bike packing
Yes.
in the States? Yeah. So where you're combining this sort of really lightweight overnight camping or bivvying with traveling long distances and on a bike. And Scotland is just perfect for that. You know, I was talking about this sort of network of forestry tracks that we have and hill tracks. So I thought, well, I quite like that. I'd like to get a bike to be able to go out with the kids, and just where I live is just one of the sort of premier mountain bike areas of Scotland anyway. So I decided, right, this year I'm going to take the plunge and buy a mountain bike, and with a view to most stuff that I'm going to do is going to be off-road, and start off by doing some small trips, and then next year I would really love to do an episode of my podcast on bike packing and go off and do a trip and record that. So that's the plan. I knew nothing about bikes, but luckily I got lots of friends who do, and they told me you need to get a hardtail mountain bike for what you want to do, which is what I've done. And I literally took delivery of that on Monday this week, and I had my first trip out this morning, just along a forestry track, and then ended up with a few kilometers of single track, lots of mud, lots of water, lots of rocks, a little bit of pushing the bike, but boy, it was fun. It was really, really fun. And it's I guess, you know, this is obvious to anybody who rides a bike, but it's just being able to look at a map and think, oh, well, I'm not walking, I'm biking. I can really stretch the distance I'm doing, and I can actually really make some fun journeys. And I was just out for 3 hours, but did this really nice loop, all off-road. I literally had sort of 500 meters of road at the finish, and that's it, from the house. And it was didn't see anybody on the route I was on. And yeah, I'd spend a little bit of time pushing the bike. Obviously I don't have a huge amount of technical skills yet on the steeper and more difficult ground. So there was a bit of hiker bike involved, but it was really, really good fun. I loved it. I can't wait to do more. And I definitely can't wait to try and combine it with some overnight stuff, maybe next year, next spring.
Boy, it sounds like a ton of fun. I've been mountain biking off and on for a few years, but it was just this season when I actually got enough skill to be able to just thoroughly enjoy a quick, curvy downhill, that sort of a thing. And in the past, I was a road biker like yourself. And when I got on the single track trails with, narrow trails and tight corners and some severe penalties for going off, where we bike here, if you go off the trail, it's a cliff or a long tumble, one of the two. So,
right.
It was a little intimidating, and I found myself fighting the bicycle a lot at first. And recently learning the skill to get the bike to corner the way that it should and do what it needs to do, and I was able to quit fighting the bike and just go and enjoy it, then it feels much more like skiing on a black diamond or something like that, So it gets more and more fun as you go, and the more skill you learn, the more fun it gets. And I had to ask you about it just because I'm really enthused about it right now. I'm going to guess that we've done 20 sizable mountain bike rides in the last 8 weeks or so, and it's just been so much fun. So we've had a ton of fun with that.
And do you tend to do sort of single days out, or have you done any multi-day stuff?
I have not done multi-day trips yet, and part of the reason for that is I'm not geared up for it. You can put all your stuff in a pack and put it on your back, but if it's heavy, you're going to be so top-heavy that you're not going to be able to bike well. And so getting the gear that keeps the weight, the panniers and what have you, the bike packs that go in the frame of the bike and on the handlebars to keep the weight low enough that your center of gravity allows you then to go off trail and still, have confidence. I'm not geared up for that quite yet.
Still though, I mean, that's the thing, is you can have just a lot of fun in one day, can't you? I mean, you can travel a fair distance and have more than enough fun, I think.
Oh, certainly. And where we bike, it's the vertical feet more than the distance, I think, that gets us. It's pretty common for us to do 3,000 vertical feet on a ride and up and then back down again. And so, you get an amazing workout even if your distance is only 10 or 12 miles. So it's, we've just had a ton of fun with it. So welcome to mountain biking. That's exciting.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I've been reading huge amounts about it and watching lots of YouTube videos, and I was really interested to listen to Jim just a few months ago on your podcast talking about his Tour Divide, and those sort of trips sort of blow my mind. These people that are racing for sort of days on end with minimal kit, entirely off-road. I just think that's an incredible thing to do.
Yeah, it really is, and I am looking forward to doing more of that in the future as I gear up. Now that I have the skill set, it's going to be a lot of fun. But, I really enjoy listening to you. You have so much fun information about Scotland, about winter mountaineering, and all this sort of thing. But you've created your own podcast, and it's called Mountain Podcast. It can be found at mountainpodcast.com. Tell us about that.
Well, I launched it a year ago, November last year, and I launched it as a way, as I said, I'd worked in radio for a number of years and then just found myself working in a different part of the BBC where I wasn't doing any radio production, and I was just a bit frustrated. I had this huge pile of stories that I wanted to tell and no outlet for, and of course I thought, well, I can just start a podcast, which is just the brilliance of the medium, that it doesn't require a huge amount of commitment or investment at the start. You can just give it a go. So I thought, well, if I don't, I'm just going to regret never starting it. And there was also, I thought there was a bit of a gap in the market in outdoors podcasts. So I listened to a lot of, interview sort of talk show style outdoors podcasts, but I couldn't find many that were doing stuff so more sort of story driven. So in the style of a This American Life story or a Radiolab story or whatever, with those sort of more produced features, and that was the sort of radio I'd always made. So I thought, well, maybe I should just give it a go and put it out there. And so at the moment, I do one a month, and one which is one feature a month. They're usually about between sort of 25 to 40 minutes long. That's about enough that I can manage. There's a huge amount of editing involved in producing these features, I find. So it may take, you may be out for a day recording it, but I'm usually sort of, for every day I'm recording, I'm sort of 3 or 4 days in the studio editing.
Right.
Which is fine. I really enjoy that part of it. I've always enjoyed that bit, sort of sitting there in the studio and cutting things together, mixing them with music and location and sound and things. So but it's just I am so glad I started it. It's that thing about right at the start talking about just taking those opportunities and just running with it and seeing what happens, because as you'll be aware, sort of running a podcast, you get to speak and meet and talk to such interesting people and hear so many amazing stories. And people say to me, where do you find all these stories, or where do you find all these people? And I think, once you're in this world and you're talking to people, they sort of, the stories and the people sort of self-generate. People will say, you've got to talk to this guy, you've got to talk to that person. And it's that bit hasn't been a problem at all. So I really, really enjoying joining the podcast world.
Well, it is a ton of fun, and your show is quite a bit different than our show. We do 2 shows a week, and ours is an interview format, and we go through a ton of information about all sorts of different sports. Your show is more highly produced and edited, and it's lovely. It's a work of art. It's very fun to listen to it just for the stylistic parts of it, as well as for the great stories. So I get where you're coming from. There are a handful of podcasts in the States that are outdoors based that are a little bit more along those lines, but I think you may be right. There are not that many like that, and it's fun. It's fun to listen to the stories and to hear the way that you've developed the music. It's quite a lot like listening to an extended NPR story when we listen to your show.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think you're right. In the States, you do have a more developed podcast market than we have over here in the UK. And you've got, I've listened to the Dirtbag Diaries for years, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and I've always loved that show. And recently, Outside Magazine launched a show which I really, really enjoy. A great mixture of interviews and some of the more sort of produced features. So there are shows out there, but certainly the podcast market in the UK is a bit less developed, and I think that's partly the fault of the BBC, as it were, because they put out a lot of their high quality sort of documentaries as podcasts, and it's very difficult as an independent to sort of compete with something that has cost thousands and thousands of pounds to make and has celebrity voices presenting it. So I find myself in a strange position, because for years that was me putting out radio shows as podcasts and not thinking for a minute what I was doing to the independent podcast market. And now I'm thinking, I don't know if I like this now. But as a broadcaster, it's been a really interesting experience, because there are a lot of constraints upon you when you're making programs. I made programs for BBC Radio for many years, and for a start, you've got to cut everything to really specific times. So my standard sort of time slot for many years was I had to hit 29 minutes and 50 seconds. And it is actually quite interesting how often on a first cut of my podcast episodes, how close I am to that figure. It's like muscle memory. But the great thing about producing a podcast is that it just doesn't matter how long it is. And while it's a useful discipline, I think, to learn to edit and to edit stuff out and keep it sort of quite tight and flowing, it's great to think, well, this story is worth 23 minutes, and that's what I'm going to give it. I don't have to try and extend it to fit the slot. And the other thing is, I think there's a lot of freedom in terms of the format. Like when I started Mountain, I thought, well, I don't really want to have a specific format or a type of story or bits of furniture that I must sort of hit every episode, which is very common when you're making programs for broadcast. You can really experiment quite a bit and try different things and take a few risks. And there's a huge amount of freedom in that, which I'm really enjoying.
Yeah, well, you're doing a great job with it. It's a really fun show. I've listened to several of them, and I'm going to listen to all of them before it's all said and done. I do enjoy it. I would like for you to go back and listen to our Climbing Mount Parnassus episode that we did nearly a year ago now, and it's more along the format of your show, though not quite as polished. It was just kind of a fun attempt at a different format in which we were doing a winter mountaineering climb, so it's right down the alley of what we're talking about.
I will definitely listen to that. I'll add it to my list. What I've done, I mean, I love this when you discover a new podcast, and especially one with a huge back catalogue like you have, and you can just go in and plunder the archives. So as soon as I heard about your show on the Outdoor Station here, I subscribed and then sort of went through, swiped down the archives and downloaded just on 4 or 5 that I thought I'd be interested in from the last 5 or 6 months. So I will go back further and look out for that one last year.
Well, Chris, one thing that we do, because we do have a lot of content, is we categorize all of our shows into an episode by category. So if you go to our website, theadventuresportspodcast.com, if you go to the website and click episodes by category, then we have everything, the full catalog listed there, so you can say, oh, I want to hear about motorcycling, and so there are the motorcycle podcasts, or I want to hear about mountaineering, so there are the mountaineering podcasts, or maybe it's whitewater, or, you name the sport, it's there, and that way you can easily find the shows that you most want to hear.
That is a really good idea. Yeah. Okay.
It's actually really quite a bit of work.
That's
great. So I hope people are using it, because it does take some time and some effort, but with the amount of information that we have, we felt like that was really valuable for our listeners. So
definitely. That's quite nice. I suppose if you come to an outdoors podcast, but you have a specific set of interests, rather than somebody maybe listening to one or two and thinking, oh no, I haven't heard anything about fly fishing or whatever, they can, I guess, go to your website and just find all the ones they want to listen to.
Yeah, and our hope is that people can explore new sports that way. It's a big part of the Adventure Sports Podcast, is that we want to introduce people to new sports so that people will get out and do more of it. We just feel like there's so much value in going out and connecting with nature and being healthy, and it builds memories and it builds health. And so anyway, we hope that people will say, well, I've always wondered about canoeing. I wonder if I could find anything on that. So, that way they can cross over and hear new things too.
Yeah, we didn't even get onto canoeing. There's lots of good canoeing in Scotland. I do a little bit of that, but we'll have to give that a miss, I think.
Yeah, well, Chris, it's been delightful to have you on the show. And what we should do is probably have you on again in a few months and talk about that canoeing and some of the other adventures that you've had, because you've got a lot to share, and we really appreciate your time today.
Well, I would love to do that, Kurt. I'll tell you what would be really good is if I do get myself fit enough and equipped to do a bike packing trip, I can maybe come back and tell you how that went.
Well, I would love that. And we have had several people on the show that have done extensive bike packing, and they've also incorporated pack rafting in with the bike packing. So what they do is they go on an extended 10-day to 15-day or even 3 or 4 week trip where they're off trail, and when they run out of, off road, but when they run out of trail, then they inflate a raft, put their bike on it, and they paddle rivers to get to the next point. So really fun stuff. We should put something like that together.
Wow, that sounds a pretty special trip, that. Mind you, lugging a raft on a bike and then strapping a bike to a raft.
Yeah, well, these are special rafts. They're quite light. They're very small but stable, and so there are ways to do it. They actually put most of their gear inside of the tubes of the raft, which keeps the center of gravity very low. So it's interesting what they're doing now, but what a delightful time that would be. So come to Colorado. Let's go play.
Oh, I would love to. Yeah, I would love to come. Well, I would definitely love to. I've never been to the States before, so...
Well, certainly you're most welcome. So again, thank you very much for your time today. And, for all of our listeners out there, get out there and have some fun, but also go to mountainpodcast.com. Give Chris's show a listen. Be sure to come back to us when you're done, but I think Chris is doing great work over there. So Chris, it's been a delight.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure for me as well. Thank you very much.
You bet. Take care.
First of all, thank you so much for listening. It means the world to us that you choose to listen to this show. If you'd like to help us further, you can leave a review on iTunes, share us with your friends, your family. It goes a long way to grow in the show. You can also support us financially through patreon.com/adventuresportspodcast. Link is in the show notes. And also, if you have an idea of who could be a good guest for the show, we're always looking for people to tell their story about the outdoors or adventure. So if you know someone, please reach out. Email us at info@adventuresportspodcast.com. And until then, get out there and have some fun.
Freakonomics Radio is sponsored by Adidas. Check out the latest footwear innovation from Adidas, the Adizero Adios Pro 2, which features carbon fiber energy rods that are both lightweight and precisely tuned for a more anatomical transition. Everything from the ultra-light polyester upper to the resculpted midsole and the reinvented outsoles are designed for speed. Visit adidas.com to learn more today.
Own the road with T-Mobile, the leader in 5G. Whether you're cruising through Nashville on I-40, heading down I-90 to Boston, or touring Santa Cruz on the 5, you'll be covered by the largest 5G network. T-Mobile covers the most interstate highway miles in America with 5G.
See 5G device coverage and access details at T-Mobile.com. Most reliable according to independent third-party Umlaut from crowdsourced user experience data from January to July 2021. Fastest according to Open Signal Awards based on average speeds in USA. 5G user experience report July 2021.